At the beginning of August, Russian media reported that Ukrainian drone strikes had killed 7 civilians at a beach resort in southern Russia, and 4 more in occupied Crimea. Verified video evidence from one strike shows smoke rising from the sand amid horrified onlookers. Civilian deaths are an unavoidable but deeply uncomfortable part of wars that are increasingly fought far beyond the front lines, thanks to long-range drones and missiles. Russia has killed thousands of Ukrainians since 2022 in countless direct hits on residential neighborhoods and other civilian infrastructure across the country. But as Ukraine expands its medium and long-range strike capabilities, Russian authorities are increasingly accusing Kyiv of doing the same thing, deliberately targeting civilians. I'm Anna Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv. This week, we're going to look at what we actually know about civilian deaths from Ukrainian strikes on Russia, and how Russian state media convolutes and skews the narrative of these incidents for propaganda purposes. So, to start, let's be blunt. Russian civilians are sometimes directly or indirectly killed by Ukraine's strikes carried out in the country's defense. Russia's foreign ministry claimed in late 2025 that over 7,000 civilians have been killed by Ukrainian attacks since February 2022, with more than another 17,000 wounded. This allegedly encompasses all attacks using artillery, rockets, missiles, and drones, which have different geographic ranges and impacts. There are no ways of independently verifying these numbers, as international monitors aren't able to cross-check or corroborate them, and there's no reason to believe that the Russian government, with its long history of fabrication, is being steadfastly honest on this one extremely sensitive point. However, we can contrast that number with the UN's verified minimum of more than 16,000 Ukrainian civilians killed by Russian strikes since 2022, and nearly 49,000 reported injured. These numbers only reflect documented deaths that have been verified by independent monitors. The real toll is likely higher, especially when you take into account the difficulty of getting and verifying information from frontline and occupied regions. More than 800 Ukrainian children have been documented among the dead, and there have been countless stories of entire families obliterated by direct hits to their homes. These numbers took a sharp increase in 2025 when Russia ramped up its wave-style attacks on Ukrainian cities, launching hundreds of drones per night. It's further grown from month to month in the first half of 2026 due to increased short-range drone attacks in frontline areas, and increased long-range missile strikes on Ukrainian cities in the rear. Ukrainian civilians die by Russia's hand on a daily basis. It's an uncomfortable fact that in many countries, military targets, bases, weapons factories, etc., are often located near or among civilian infrastructure. Now, international humanitarian law says that this proximity should be avoided whenever possible, but in practice, that rarely happens. And then there's also dual-use infrastructure, which are objects which might not have started out as military targets, but then become them over time, like a clothing factory that's converted to a weapons factory, or an unremarkable road that then becomes important for transporting supplies, or a university campus that starts housing the military. While it's not easy to prove that a country is using civilian infrastructure with the intent to hide or shield military targets, the fact is that military infrastructure is often embedded in civilian infrastructure, especially in times of war. Then we have another point to differentiate: direct versus indirect deaths. And by that, I mean that there is a difference between programming a ballistic missile to ram directly into a residential building and a drone being shot down mid-air and then crashing down to destroy that same building. The result might be the same in both cases, but the drone interception is more of a secondary effect rather than a direct attack, in a way that a programmed missile strike is. A military launching a long-distance weapon should, at least in principle, take into account the potential secondary effects, whether the weapon reaches its intended target or not, but proving exact circumstances and assigning responsibility in such cases is rarely straightforward. In the case of the beach strike, Russian authorities said that the 7 deaths were caused by drone debris, but even that wording is somewhat ambiguous. It's not clear if the drone, which looks pretty intact in video evidence, was physically shot down by Russian air defense, and some posit that the crash could have been caused by electronic warfare jamming. Despite their admission that the drone had suffered some kind of malfunction during its journey that would render it into debris, Russia maintains that the strike was directly targeting civilians. My final point in this section relates to optics. Civilian deaths look bad in the media. Whether it's the US bombing an Iranian school or Russia hitting Ukraine's largest children's hospital, these stories are emotionally triggering for people worldwide, the majority of whom are civilians themselves. Disregard for human life is not in line with common understandings of democracy or humanitarian law, and this makes a tangible impact on how countries execute military operations. Ukraine is not waging an imperial war, it's defending itself from one while trying to build trust and support among Western allies. The documented civilian toll in Ukraine is vastly larger than the reported toll from Ukrainian strikes inside Russia. And Russia's refusal to acknowledge this, while framing Russian civilian deaths as abject terrorism, shows just how important a rhetorical device this is for them. But more on that later. The Kyiv Independent has kept working through years of escalating Russian strikes on Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine, and we'll be here for plenty more. Thanks to you. The majority of our funding comes from readers and viewers around the world who contribute a small amount each month to help us keep the lights on, the cameras rolling, and the news coming. If you'd like to get involved, visit the link in the description below or scan the QR code. It'll tell you all you need to know, including the membership perks. Thank you also to everyone who donates via YouTube. We're now going to look at a few notable examples that Russia has held up since 2022. A large percentage of civilian deaths in Russia occur in the regions closest to the Ukrainian border, like Belgorod and Kursk oblasts, where shorter-range shelling and drones can be launched across the border in addition to the use of longer-range weapons. Ukraine's strikes inside Russia overwhelmingly focus on targets that can be directly connected to the war effort: military facilities like airfields and bases, defense production facilities, oil refineries, and other infrastructure that feeds into the war machine. But as we established earlier, sometimes those things lie close to civilian infrastructure. Belgorod Oblast, which borders Ukraine's Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts, has reported several of the largest strikes allegedly launched by Ukraine, with Russian authorities claiming dozens of casualties from drones and missiles hitting residential buildings, a shopping mall, and other civilian infrastructure. In May of 2024, 15 people were allegedly killed in Belgorod city when a missile hit an apartment building, causing it to collapse. The Russian Defense Ministry said that the collapse had been caused by intercepted missile fragments. Analysts speculated that given the positioning of the blast, the missile in question could have been fired by Russia itself, although no firm evidence was ever established. Also in summer of 2024, there was another deadly beach strike in occupied Sevastopol, in which an American-made ATACMS missile was shot down by Russian air defense, with the debris killing 4 people, according to Russian authorities. Now, that one was particularly notable because it was done using a foreign, high-power weapon, and at the time, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that the US was responsible for the attack, given that they'd provided Ukraine with ATACMS. A US official told Reuters that the strike was aimed at destroying a Russian missile launcher on the peninsula, and that it was the interception by Russian air defense that caused deadly shrapnel to rain down on beachgoers. Ukraine's Navy spokesperson iterated this a bit more broadly, stating that Ukraine does not inflict fire damage on Russia's civilian objects or population. He added that Ukraine does continue to warn people to avoid proximity to Russian military facilities, which one could interpret as a tacit indicator of the intended target. Still, Russian state media painted the incident as an act of targeted terrorism. And then we get to one of the more recent examples which sparked one of the largest media frenzies to date. On May 22nd of this year, a Ukrainian strike hit the town of Starobilsk in occupied Luhansk Oblast, with Russia claiming that 21 students at a local Votech school were killed in a deliberate Ukrainian attack on civilians. Ukraine denies this, saying that they were targeting military headquarters in the area. Kyiv Independent journalists investigated this case to establish what actually happened, and I'm joined by Linda Hourani, our junior investigative reporter, to tell us more. So, Linda, you actually investigated the strike on Starobilsk, and what were your main findings about the victims?
Yeah, so I managed to track down social media accounts of the alleged victims. They were all on Russian social media VK, which you can access only with VPN from other countries. And I found the pages of those victims, and I confirmed those people to be real. Because their pages went inactive on the day before the attack. Also, there were many condolences messages left on their pages by their friends, their relatives, and also their pages suggest that these people were actually students of these colleges because they either had this included in their profile that they are students of this college, or they've been following the pages of the colleges. And I wanted also to emphasize I'm talking about two colleges because they were two neighboring buildings. Also, those students, they were between 18 and 22 years old. And there is also an inconsistency in what Russia was claiming, because from the first day of the attack, Russian authorities have been saying that the victims were minors and that Ukraine deliberately struck the building to kill the minors. Later, the Russian authorities published the list of the victims, and the dates of birth there indicated that they were actually older than 18 years old. Also, it's worth mentioning that the students, some of them, were involved in some activities organized by Russian state-backed organizations. And more broadly, there is a practice of students from the college undergoing certain military trainings. Also, ones organized by the Warrior Center, which is another Russian organization. A Ukrainian publication, Inform Napalm, found that one of the students of pedagogical college, he underwent this military training, which also included learning how to operate drones with the special equipment that they had. And this student wasn't the victim of the attack, but still it underpins that there is certain practice going on in educational facilities in Russian-occupied territories. And at the same time, we cannot state that the alleged victims were for sure involved in military activities, because we don't have this evidence. The attack on Starobilsk was also confirmed by Ukraine's general staff. However, they stressed that the strike targeted only military facilities, including one of the headquarters of the Rubicon drone unit. It's a very elite Russian drone unit, which is also linked to targeting civilians. The Ukraine's general staff didn't provide further details besides their official statement, so we don't have more information. And also the interesting part is that from the satellite imagery, I could confirm that it's not only the college buildings that were targeted, but in total there were 5 buildings targeted. And Russia is not really talking about this. The main attention is, of course, on this one building. Russia also organized a press tour to Starobilsk, and it contained the friendly sort of media outlets from either friendly countries or the journalists who just went, who took the Russian side and who were like stationed there for a while and who report very complimentary reports about Russia. I know that, for example, Russia was also trying to invite some of the Western reporters to the site. For example, the journalist from BBC, but he refused to come there, basically saying that it's just unsafe for him to come there. That's why journalists are using a lot of open source intelligence, doing some OSINT work, researching social media accounts, trying to contact the people from there, which is also very hard. So yeah.
Starobilsk was a huge deal in Russian media and was followed by large strikes on Ukrainian cities in subsequent weeks. Putin himself talked about it as a terrorist attack and cited it as evidence of Ukraine's desire to keep waging war. And less than 2 weeks later, he rejected President Volodymyr Zelensky's early June letter asking to reopen peace negotiations. Now, this isn't a full list of deaths that Russia has weaponized in this way, but they are the biggest media sensations of this kind. And I want to point out that even if Ukraine was directly responsible, which has not been proven in many cases, they don't exactly demonstrate a linear escalation over time in the way that Russia's strikes on Ukrainian cities do. Even accepting Russia's casualty claims in all of these cases, the combined toll is lower than the number killed in Kyiv alone over roughly the past 2 months. If Ukraine was battering Russian cities at the frequency and intensity that Russia is battering Ukraine, Russian state media would be talking about it every single day. But they're not. They hype up these specific incidents precisely because they're not as common. And that tells us something about the strategy at play. In order to understand how these attacks play into a much longer pattern of media manipulation and influence by the Kremlin, we need to rewind much further, to more than 2 decades before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Boris Yeltsin is on his way out. The economic and social turmoil of the 90s has left deep scars on the Russian public. The people need a new champion in time for the new millennium. And just as a new leader begins to distinguish himself, a series of shocking, seemingly random apartment bombings rock Moscow and other cities. The new government claimed that the attacks were the work of terrorists from the Caucasus, and used them as a rhetorical tool to drum up support for Russia's second invasion of Chechnya. And when 3 people later identified as members of the FSB were caught placing something that looked suspiciously like explosives in the basement of an apartment block in neighboring Ryazan, they tried to brush it off as a training exercise. Although debate remains around what exactly happened in those attacks and who orchestrated them, Russia did reinvade Chechnya, and the head of the new government solidified his role as Russia's ferocious defender. And more than 2.5 decades later, he is still operating from the same playbook. Putin's claims about so-called Ukrainian terrorism began long before the full-scale invasion. Between 2014 and 2022, he frequently invoked narratives about Ukraine committing targeted war crimes in Donbass, the most graphic being a completely debunked state media story that Ukrainian forces had crucified a 3-year-old boy in Slavyansk.
The city center, Lenin Square, with the city council on one side. It's the only square where you can gather all the residents. They gathered all the women there because there were no men left. Women, girls, old people, that's it. They call it a show execution. They took a child, a 3-year-old boy, little, wearing only underwear and a t-shirt, and nailed him like Jesus to a bulletin board. One of them nailed him while 2 others held him.
Stories like this played into broader narratives that would form the basis of his justification for fully invading, that it was Russia's duty to liberate the people of Ukraine from the terroristic Ukrainian government. We're joined by CEO of the Reckoning Project, Janine di Giovanni, to tell us more. How would you sort of characterize the Kremlin's strategy of pointing at outside groups or states or actors, whether Chechnya, Ukraine, and then labeling them as terrorists to sort of justify extreme action against them?
This is a classic technique in warfare. It's to blame the victim, to shift the blame of the horrific atrocity crimes that Vladimir Putin's been enforcing upon the Ukrainian people onto them. He did the same thing with Chechnya, Islamic terrorists. He did the same thing in Syria when they joined the battle in 2015. It's a very strategic and efficient, especially if you use propaganda to reinforce it. If you look, he's not alone doing it. It's precisely what the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, is doing right now in terms of Gaza. So to blame the victims so that they could bomb hospitals, destroy schools, kill children. So in 1999, when Putin was a young, fresh former KGB agent who had suddenly risen to power, he really had to prove himself to the Russian people. And one way of doing this was to label the Chechens Islamic terrorists. The war that then followed, the Second Chechen War, was brutal. And when I arrived in Grozny in December 2000, it had been leveled to a parking lot. The level of bombing, the destruction of residential areas was just immense. It's precisely the same pattern that he used in Aleppo in 2015, 15 years later. And it was exactly the same pattern he used in Ukraine, in Mariupol in particular. There is a logic to this, and it's basically to instill fear into the population. So if you can make people frightened by taking away their infrastructure, their hospitals, their schools, their roads, their apartment buildings, if you can render them helpless, then you fill them with fear. And his tactic or his thought was that if we do this, then maybe they will turn against their own government and join us. And it's a horrific way to terrify civilians. And that is Putin, what we at the Reckoning Project call Putin's gruesome playbook.
Mm-hmm. And then how effective is it? I mean, in Russia's case and more broadly, like how much does this really rally people? Is there a tangible linear line from A to B with it?
I think the propaganda is unfortunately extremely effective. And, it's hard to say what is going on precisely in Russia right now because I speak to dissidents who've either left or who are protesting against Putin. I think that, the whole wave of young Russians that have been killed in this war, and of course we don't know the figures because he hides them, um, has left a country which will be scarred for generations to come, almost in a World War I type sense, where you have lost a generation. And of course, they went, some of them unwillingly, and some of them because they needed the money. They came from parts of Russia where they had very little money and very little opportunity. So I think the aftermath of this war, when it does end, and it will eventually, will be a society, a Russian society that will need to reshift into something entirely different. And will something even more extreme come after him? We don't know what will come next in Russia, but what we do know is that their society has been forever altered by this war, as it has with Ukrainian society as well.
As we touched on last week when talking about Ukraine's recent 40-day campaign against Russia, this summer is an important time for the Kremlin. They're gearing up for parliamentary elections in September, where Putin's United Russia Party will no doubt maintain its grip on power. But military analysts suspect that the elections could be followed by the first round of mass mobilization in Russia since 2022. This will probably not go over too well with the Russian public, who are increasingly affected by the years of war. And with that in mind, is it any wonder that the Kremlin is propping up incidents like Starobilsk and the deaths of the beachgoers this month? Is it any wonder that they don't consider it hypocritical that civilians are killed every day in Ukraine, a country that didn't initiate the war? And yet on a far less frequent occasion when civilians are killed by Ukraine defending itself, it's an act of terrorism that warrants swift retaliation. This isn't surprising, but the contradiction can be infuriating. Whether the state-run media storm around Ukrainian strikes will really motivate Russians to continue the war and accept new conditions like mass mobilization remains to be seen. Although polls by the independent Levada Center indicate that support for the war has gone up in the short term when the war is brought to Ukrainian territory in significant new ways, like after Ukraine's 2024 incursion into Kursk Oblast, the overall trend is away from support for the war and toward negotiations. There isn't solid polling evidence that deaths caused directly or indirectly by Ukrainian airstrikes creates meaningful public support for the war. But this is clearly Putin's favorite strategy. Name an enemy, blame them for crimes against humanity, however tenuous, and then attack ruthlessly. We don't expect to see this change, but hopefully this gives you just a little bit more context about how these stories are framed using Russia's hypocritical definitions of terrorism and responsibility.
Hello, my name's Jimmy Rush and I'm Special Correspondent with the Kyiv Independent. And today we had a question by one of our members asking how easy it is to calculate where a missile will be shot down with an interceptor. So this depends on a number of factors. Firstly, what missile you're shooting down. Russian cruise missiles like a KH-101 typically fly at high subsonic speeds, so around 900 to 1,000 kilometers per hour, which is around Mach 7 to Mach 8 at sea level. And shooting down these missiles is relatively simple as long as you have an air defense asset in range. Ukrainian air defense regularly shoots down most, if not all, cruise missiles that are fired at Ukraine using a variety of air defense assets, from man-portable air defense systems like Stinger and Eagler to larger Western-supplied air defense systems like NASAMS and even Patriot from time to time, or even manned jets, the Ukrainian Air Force, MiG-29s, F-16s firing air-to-air missiles. Ballistic missiles are far harder to intercept, and engaging an incoming ballistic missile is often described as hitting a bullet with a bullet, for a very good reason, because it's an extremely difficult challenge. So ballistic missiles fly on a relatively predictable trajectory, but they have an extremely high speed. An Iskander-M can reach around 2.1 kilometers a second in its terminal attack phase as they dive down towards their targets. And this means that they can cover the distance from their launch sites in Russia to Kyiv within 3 to 6 minutes, giving precious little time to react. It's actually quite common for ballistic missiles to impact their targets in Kyiv whilst air raid sirens are sounding, or even before they start sounding in some cases. In order to intercept such ballistic missiles, you need a sophisticated air defense system with a very, very capable radar, an effective fire control system, and a fast and highly maneuverable interceptor. The air defense system needs to be able to quickly detect the incoming threat, quickly calculate an interception vector, quickly launch an interceptor, which then needs to maneuver and physically impact the incoming ballistic missile. There's actually only one air defense system in Ukraine that can do this effectively, and that's the Patriot air defense system firing the Patriot PAC-3 MSE interceptor. These interceptors are extremely expensive. They cost around $4 million per shot, and they actually physically hit an incoming ballistic missile to ensure a kill. Unfortunately, they're in precious short supply, largely due to the American war with Iran. Obviously, Iran has been firing a lot of ballistic missiles at targets in the Gulf, and there are a lot of countries which require Patriot PAC-3 interceptors at the moment. So Ukraine is, unfortunately, at the back of the list.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's truly thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.